Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, greatest figure in modern India, 1869 to 1948. Part 1. India and South Africa. Preparation. In every period of man's activity, there have appeared significant figures to whom history later points as the leader of a new age. Such men are dynamic, purposeful, prophetic, and dangerous to the established order and habit of their time. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was such a figure, known to the world as Mahatma Gandhi. Born on October 2nd, 1869, in the small state of Porbandar, Western India, where his grandfather, father, and elder brother were prime ministers. His father later became prime minister of the Kathiawar states of Rajkot, to which Mohandas was taken as a boy of 7, and Vankaneer. Mohandas was the youngest child of a large family. Though well known and influential, it was of humble stock. Unlike many of his distinguished contemporaries, Mohandas Gandhi came not from the first or Brahmin caste of Hindus, but from the Baniya subcaste of the third or Vaisya caste. Nor were the Gandhis in any way noted for scholarship. Kaba Gandhi, the father of Mohandas, had no education save that of experience. In his academic education, Mohandas never went beyond the matriculation examination of London University. For his mother, he had a beautiful and steadfast love. Her gentleness of character, her natural wisdom, and her deep religious sense made a profound impression upon him from his earliest years. Probably this love was one of the deepest emotions of his life and gave him the tenderness that is so much a part of his otherwise Spartan disposition. It was in this background that his early years were spent. Following the custom of his day and country, he was betrothed when he was 7 and was married at 13 to a girl slightly younger. Although still children, they shared the same sleeping room, and as soon as the boy was physically capable, consummation of the marriage took place. Much to his own horror and disgust in later years, his reactions to that period of his life, with its tormenting unrest, brought a strong antipathy to the expression of sex life. When the fires of early manhood had died down, he vowed himself a celibacy for self discipline, a fact that colored all the after years. He was fully believed that his child wife was his own to mold as he liked, irrespective of what she herself desired. Fortunately, she possessed a personality and a will not easily subdued to his pattern, and she always retained some peculiar quality and an independence of her own. Being of a Vaishnava family, largely influenced by Jainism, He was strictly vegetarian. Yet, as a youth, he was tempted secretly to eat meat and so break the caste rules. And this for two reasons. The first was his own delicacy of physique and an intense desire to become a strong, healthy man. The second was his earnest desire for India to be a free and forceful nation. He reasoned within himself, after listening to the talk of other young people around him, that Englishmen walked over the land as conquerors. They had power to command others. They were meat eaters. Therefore, if India wished to free herself from the domination of the foreigner, she must cultivate strength, and meat eating was the first step in his direction. The taste of flesh was, however, obnoxious, and flesh eating soon ended. But he had done more than break his caste rules. For the first and last time, he consciously lied. Gandhi had repeatedly called himself a truth seeker and had learned, in the course of his search, that truth is a condition of being, not a quality outside of oneself or a moral acquisition, that it is of the very essence of the divine in man. Though he saw deceit and falsehood all around him, and knew that it was accepted as the standard of life by people occupying positions of authority and influence, he was never afterwards tempted to yield to it, even when to have done so would have brought advantage and no condemnation. For healing, he always had a great love and some aptitude. And when at the age of 17, his family in conclave suggested his going to England to study law, he begged to be allowed to study medicine instead. This, however, was not permitted. Law was chosen for him, but the love of healing remained. And though he could not study in the orthodox schools of medicine, he gratified his desire by studying various forms of nature cure treatment and by experimenting with these on his own person and on his friends and relatives. Some of these experiments produced remarkable results, possibly not only due to the treatment but to his devoted and instinctive nursing. One such striking case was his cure of two plague patients in South Africa, when 20 others who were treated by the orthodox methods died. Another equally remarkable cure was that of his wife, who in middle life developed pernicious anemia and was given up by the doctors as a hopeless case, unless recourse could be had to meat juices and other special treatment. This being refused, the doctor in attendance left the case, and Gandhi's nature cure methods were resorted to. Soon, an improvement in the general condition of the patient was noted. The treatment continued, and she recovered. Before leaving India for his studies abroad, his mother persuaded him to take a solemn vow before a Jain monk, never to touch wine, women, or meat. This vow he kept religiously, despite the many temptations that were thrust upon him. His first days in England were an agony. He was homesick and unhappy. Everything was strange: the people, the houses, the method of life, the idiom of the language, and worst of all, the food. He felt an intense longing for home and its familiar sights, sounds, and smells. But to have returned straight away, as his misery tempted him to do, would be an impossible act of cowardice. So he suffered and endured, frequently starving himself, so as to be sure that he did not betray his vow. He gradually settled down, made some friends, started his studies, and set himself to acquire some of the so called accomplishments of polite society. He reclothed himself, adopting the dress of the day, even to the extent of investing in a silk hat. Strange how clothes played a symbolic part in the life of this man. He never just accepted clothes, but used them as an indication of an inner conviction. In after years, having identified himself with the poor, in whose face he saw God, he wore the peasant's loincloth. He tried to learn to dance, but had no ear for rhythm, and failing in his attempt, gave it up. He also tried to learn to play the violin, but he was not an artist, except in the art of life itself, and he soon abandoned the bow and strings. He turned his attention to dietetics, always, of course, along vegetarian or fruitarian lines, and became both in England and later in South Africa an ardent propagandist. In studying these early years of Gandhi's life, it becomes easier to understand his later developments. One can see in them all the seeds that later flowered into full bloom. His innate love of truth, desire for the freedom of his motherland, love of simple things and simple people, passion for purity, even to austerity, tried courage, and quiet moral strength. All these qualities were struggling within him to find suitable expression in a field of labor big enough to call them to play. Of his law studies, little need be said. He was a conscientious worker, read the prescribed books, and was duly called to the bar by the Inner Temple, which later disbarred him because of his conviction in the Indian civil disobedience movement. He never applied for reinstatement. His studies completed, he returned to India. On his arrival at Bombay, he was greeted with the tragic news that his mother had been dead some little while. The news had been kept from him so as not to render him unhappy whilst alone in a strange land. Overwhelmed by grief, for a time he felt that the background of his life had collapsed. To add to his distress, his caste people excommunicated him because of his journeying to a foreign land. And though he performed the usual ceremonial purification rites, orthodox prejudice kept him outside the caste fold. This caste denial left no resentment. Rather, it taught him to how artificial were the barriers of caste. And he came to realize intensely the cruelty of seeking to restrict human fellowship. He gained strength from his tribulations. After some hesitation and anxiety, he commenced practice in the Bombay courts. His first case was a trial, not so much of his knowledge and ability as of his courage. To speak in public had always been an ordeal for him, and now to have to conduct a case, when the placing of the bare facts of it before the court was more than he could do. He rose to speak, but became tongue tied. Baffled, he begged to be relieved of his case, and hastened from the court in shame and anguish, vowing never to appear again until he had learned to master himself and could use his brain and body as the instruments of his will. The family fortunes were too standard to allow him to stand apart and study the art of advocacy. He felt compelled to earn money, and he returned to Rajkot to assist his brother in a small legal business already established. There his wife gave birth to their first living child. Gandhi, however, was not destined for a life set in a normal key, and soon the call came to him to move on. It is interesting to glance back over the lives of great men and to see how circumstances, apparently insignificant in themselves, take them in hand and compel them to a desired end. They seem almost to be a plaything in the hands of a player, but the player knows the end of the game. The plaything only obeys the urge that so often seems blindly to move him forward. The first great period of Gandhi's adult life, covering the years 1893 to 1940, now opens. A small hurt to self esteem, a disappointment in Porbandar, the offer of a commission to go to South Africa for a year to represent professionally an Indian firm, which had an important case pending in the South African Republic, and the first step was taken upon his path of destiny. Of South Africa and its problems, he knew practically nothing. His political sense had not as yet been developed, and of the position of Indians there he had never thought. His clients were wealthy, and he may have believed that South Africa was a land of sunshine and plenty. He arrived in Durban in 1893, having no reason to expect other than good and decent treatment. Though he had a foretaste of racial arrogance in India, it was not until he arrived in South Africa that he felt its full force and understood the grave nature of the color bar. It is not therefore surprising to find that, having made some study of the disabilities and grievances of his countrymen in Natal and the neighboring republic, he was prevailed upon by them to stay in Durban and help them to secure redress and improve their status. He made it a condition that he should receive no payment for his public work, but asked for his countrymen's support in his legal practice. If they had confidence in his professional ability throughout his stay in South Africa, and until he renounced practice in 1908 in order to devote himself entirely to the service of his countrymen there. He enjoyed to the full the confidence of a large clientele, but always he devoted a considerable portion of his earnings to charity and to the public needs of the Indian community. Of his professional work, he said, I realized that the true function of a lawyer was to unite parties riven asunder. The lesson was so indelibly burned into me that a large part of my time during the 20 years of my practice as a lawyer was occupied in bringing about private compromises of hundreds of cases. I lost nothing thereby, not even money, certainly not my soul. The Indians had originally been taken from the United Provinces, Bihar and Madras, mostly Hindus, to South Africa in 1860 under indenture at a time when the colony of Natal was threatened with bankruptcy through an inadequate supply of native African labor. The economic situation had been saved and prosperity had been restored and largely increased through the labors of these indentured Indians, in whose wake and primarily to supply whose needs, upon the insistence of the Government of India, there had followed in due course at first from Mauritius and later from Bombay, Gujarati merchants and traders, mostly Muslims. All alike were denied citizenship rights and were dubbed contemptuously coolies by the white colonists.